The morning of the Natural History Museum event dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds that seemed to mirror the tension Thomas felt as he prepared for what could be the most dangerous day of his career. He had spent the previous evening checking and rechecking his equipment, studying floor plans of the museum, and mentally rehearsing response scenarios that Davidson and Chun had briefed him on. Thomas's wounded arm was still stiff and painful, but he had convinced the medical staff that he was fit for duty. What he hadn't told them was that he had barely slept in 3 nights, haunted by images of Marcus Webb's calculating eyes and the sickening sound the knife had made as it cut through his uniform and into his flesh. As he drove through London toward the museum, Thomas noticed details that would have escaped his attention a week earlier. The white van parked near the intersection that had been there yesterday. The man in the coffee shop who glanced up from his newspaper just a moment too quickly when Thomas passed by. The woman walking her dog who seemed to be taking an unusually long time to complete what should have been a simple task. Any one of these observations could be meaningless coincidence, but Thomas had learned to trust his instincts. Someone was watching him, and that someone was probably not part of the extensive surveillance operation that Davidson had assured him would be in place. The Natural History Museum event was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., with the Prince of Wales making a brief appearance to unveil a new exhibit on climate change and conservation. It was exactly the kind of public engagement that the royal family regularly participated in, designed to show their connection to important social issues while allowing controlled public access. Thomas arrived at the museum 2 hours early for the final security briefing. The building was already buzzing with activity as exhibition staff made last-minute preparations, security personnel conducted final sweeps, and media representatives set up their equipment in designated areas. Inspector Williams met Thomas at the staff entrance, his expression grim with the kind of focused tension that comes before a critical operation. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" "Ready," Thomas replied simply, though the truth was more complicated. He felt alert, determined, and professionally prepared, but also deeply aware that everything about this day felt wrong. The attack on him had been too public, too obvious, too easy to trace back to a larger organization. Professional criminals didn't usually operate that way unless they had a specific reason for drawing attention to themselves. "Our surveillance teams are in position," Williams continued as they walked through the museum's corridors toward the Security Command Center. "We have eyes on all the entrances, rooftop coverage, and plainclothes officers throughout the building. If Petrov's people are planning something, we'll see them coming." But Thomas wasn't convinced it would be that simple. "Sir, what if the point isn't to attack the prince during the event? What if the whole purpose is to get us to commit all our resources to protecting this one location while they hit a different target entirely?" Williams paused, considering the possibility. "We've thought of that. Scotland Yard has increased security at all royal residences and other potential targets. But we can't protect everyone everywhere all the time. At some point, we have to make our stand and see what they're really planning." The Security Command Center was a temporary installation set up in one of the museum's administrative offices, filled with monitors showing feeds from dozens of cameras, radio equipment connecting various response teams, and detailed maps marking the position of every security officer in and around the building. Detective Chief Inspector Chun was coordinating the overall operation, her calm professionalism providing a reassuring presence in the controlled chaos of the command center. "Sergeant Mitchell," she acknowledged as Thomas entered. "Your position will be at the northeast entrance to the main exhibition hall. You'll have clear sight lines to the unveiling area and direct radio contact with all response teams." Davidson appeared beside them, having seemingly materialized out of nowhere in the way that intelligence operatives seem to specialize in. "We've had some interesting developments overnight," he said quietly. "One of our surveillance teams spotted 2 individuals who matched descriptions of known Petrov associates. They were conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of the museum's exterior, but they made no attempt to conceal their activities." Thomas felt that familiar chill of intuition warning him that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. "They wanted to be seen." "That's our assessment as well," Davidson confirmed. "Which raises the question of what they're trying to distract us from." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of final preparations, equipment checks, and position assignments. Thomas took his designated post at the northeast entrance, his ceremonial uniform concealing the lightweight body armor and enhanced communication equipment that had been added for this operation. To any casual observer, he looked like any other royal guard performing routine duties, but Thomas was hyper-aware of every person who entered his field of vision. The Prince of Wales arrived precisely on schedule, his motorcade sweeping into the museum's courtyard with the smooth efficiency that characterized all royal movements. Thomas watched through the windows as the prince emerged from his car, exchanging brief words with museum officials and security personnel before disappearing into the building. The public was admitted 15 minutes later, and Thomas began the delicate task of maintaining ceremonial composure while conducting active threat assessment on every individual who passed through his area. Families with children excited about seeing the exhibits, elderly couples moving slowly through the crowds, tourists with cameras and guidebooks, school groups being shepherded by teachers and chaperones. Then he saw her. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair and wearing a simple blue dress that made her look like any other museum visitor. But Thomas had learned to look beyond appearances, and something about her movement pattern caught his attention. While everyone else was moving generally toward the main exhibition area where the unveiling would take place, she was moving laterally, parallel to the crowd flow, as if she was looking for something specific. Thomas activated his communication device. Control, I have a potential person of interest. Female, approximately 30, blue dress, brown hair, moving against crowd flow near the dinosaur exhibits. Copy that. Can you maintain visual contact? Affirmative. Thomas began moving slowly along his designated patrol route, keeping the woman in sight while appearing to conduct routine security observations. She was definitely searching for something, her eyes scanning the area systematically rather than showing the casual interest of a typical museum visitor. The woman stopped near a fire exit that, according to Thomas's briefing, led to a service corridor connecting to the museum's loading dock. She glanced around quickly, then produced a small electronic device from her purse and held it briefly against the door's security panel. Control, target is tampering with the fire exit security system. Recommend immediate investigation. Negative. Continue observation. We want to see what she does next. Thomas understood the tactical reasoning, but every instinct told him that allowing the woman to continue her activities was a mistake. If she was preparing an escape route or entry point for other operatives, stopping her now might prevent a larger disaster. The woman completed whatever she was doing to the door and began moving back toward the main exhibition area. But now her movement was different, more purposeful, as if she had completed the first phase of a plan and was moving on to the second. The unveiling ceremony was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. Thomas could hear the crowd gathering in the main hall, their excited conversations creating the kind of background noise that would make it difficult to detect unusual sounds or activities. The prince would be exposed to public view for approximately 15 minutes while he delivered brief remarks and formally opened the new exhibit. Thomas's radio crackled with updates from other security positions. Position South reports, all clear. Rooftop team reports no unusual activity. Mobile units report normal traffic patterns. But the woman in the blue dress was now positioned near a pillar that provided her with clear sight lines to the ceremony area, while keeping her partially concealed from most of the security positions. Thomas was one of the few people who could see her clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. She was no longer looking around casually or moving with the uncertain pace of a museum visitor. She was standing perfectly still, her attention focused completely on the area where the prince would soon appear, and her right hand was resting inside her purse in a way that suggested she was gripping something. Control. Target is now in position with possible concealed weapon. I'm moving to intercept. Negative. Maintain your position. We have other units moving to investigate. But Thomas could see that the other units were still minutes away, threading through crowds of people who would be endangered if violence erupted in the confined space of the museum hall. The woman was less than 50 feet from where the prince would be standing, well within range for any number of weapons that could be concealed in a purse. Thomas made a decision that went against his orders, but aligned with his deeper duty to protect lives. He began moving directly toward the woman, using his size and the authority of his uniform to clear a path through the crowd. The woman saw him coming. Their eyes met across the space between them, and Thomas saw recognition and calculation in her expression. She knew that he had identified her as a threat, and she was making her own tactical decisions about how to respond. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed that characterizes life-or-death confrontations. The woman's hand emerged from her purse holding not a gun, as Thomas had expected, but a small cylindrical object that he recognized with horror as a military-grade flashbang grenade. She pulled the pin and let the safety lever fly free, giving Thomas perhaps 3 seconds before the device would detonate with enough light and sound to disorient everyone in the immediate area. In the chaos that would follow, other operatives could move freely, taking advantage of the confusion to carry out whatever their real mission might be. Thomas had no time to think, only to react. He launched himself forward, driving through the crowd with desperate urgency, knowing that he had to reach the woman before the grenade exploded. People screamed and scattered as they saw him charging toward them, some recognizing the danger and others simply responding to the panic in the air. He reached the woman just as she drew her arm back to throw the grenade toward the ceremony area. Thomas crashed into her with all his weight and momentum, driving both of them to the ground while wrapping his arms around her to contain the explosive device. They hit the floor hard, Thomas using his body to shield the crowd from the worst of the blast that was now inevitable. The woman struggled beneath him, trying to push the grenade away from herself, but Thomas held on grimly, knowing that letting it roll free into the crowd would cause casualties that he couldn't live with. The flashbang detonated with a sound like the world ending, and a burst of light that temporarily blinded everyone within a 50-foot radius. Thomas felt the concussion wave slam through his body, his ears ringing, and his vision filled with dancing spots of color. But he was alive, and more importantly, the people around him were alive. Security personnel converged on their position within seconds, their own ears ringing, but their training allowing them to function despite the sensory disruption. The woman was unconscious, either from the impact of Thomas's tackle or the effects of her own explosive device. Thomas was helped to his feet, his uniform singed and his hearing damaged but otherwise functional. But as the immediate crisis passed, Thomas realized that something was still wrong. The flashbang had been meant to create confusion, which suggested that the real attack was supposed to happen during the chaos that followed. Since that chaos had been largely contained, where were the other operatives who should have been moving to take advantage of it? The answer came through his damaged hearing as multiple voices began shouting over the radio channels at once. Shots fired at Buckingham Palace. Explosion at Westminster Bridge. Armed assault in progress at Downing Street. Thomas understood with sickening clarity what had really happened. The museum event had been a diversion, exactly as he had suspected. But it hadn't been designed to draw security resources away from other targets. It had been designed to identify and neutralize him specifically. Petrov had studied the security response to the knife attack and realized that Thomas was the kind of person who would notice details that others missed, who would act on instinct even when it meant disobeying orders. The museum operation had been carefully designed to put him in a position where his protective instincts would override his tactical training, exactly as they had. While Thomas was tackling the woman with the flashbang grenade, other teams had been moving against the real targets. The attacks were coordinated, professional, and precisely timed to take advantage of the moment when key security personnel were focused on protecting the prince at the museum. Davidson appeared at Thomas's side, his face grim with the realization of how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. Casualties? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. We don't know yet. But preliminary reports suggest this was more about sending a message than causing maximum damage. They hit multiple targets simultaneously to prove they could, but the actual attacks seemed designed more for psychological impact than body count. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that the loss of life might be minimal, but rage at the realization that he had been used as a pawn in a larger game. Petrov had manipulated him into exactly the response he wanted, using Thomas's own dedication and protective instincts against him. But as Thomas looked down at the unconscious woman who had been willing to detonate an explosive device while she was holding it, he realized that the story was far from over. She was alive, in custody, and, unlike Marcus Webb, she might actually provide the information they needed to understand what Petrov was really planning. Because Thomas was now certain that everything they had experienced so far had been preparation for something larger. The knife attack, the museum diversion, the coordinated strikes against multiple targets. All of it had been designed to gather intelligence, test responses, and position pieces for a final operation that would dwarf everything that had come before. The real question was whether they could figure out what that operation was before Petrov decided he had learned everything he needed to know about British security capabilities. Thomas looked around at the confused and frightened people in the museum, thought about the attacks happening across London at that very moment, and realized that his personal war with Petrov had only just begun. The shocking ending that no one could have believed was that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one throwing knives or detonating flashbangs. The most dangerous enemy was the one who understood that the greatest weapon against dedicated protectors was their own willingness to sacrifice everything for the people they had sworn to defend. And Petrov was just getting started. 3 days after the knife attack, Thomas Mitchell sat in a secure briefing room deep within Scotland Yard headquarters, his left arm still in a sling, but his mind sharper than ever. The wound had required 12 stitches and would leave a permanent scar, but Thomas considered himself lucky to be alive. The medical examiner had confirmed that if the knife had hit him just 2 inches higher, it would have severed a major artery, and he could have bled to death within minutes. Around the conference table sat some of the most experienced security and intelligence professionals in Britain. Inspector Williams was there, along with Detective Chief Inspector Sarachon from the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Unit, and a man introduced only as Davidson, who clearly worked for one of the intelligence services. The atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with the urgency that comes when professionals realize they're dealing with something far more serious than initially apparent. "Gentlemen, lady," Davidson began, opening a thick manila folder, "what we're about to discuss does not leave this room. The knife attack 3 days ago was not an isolated incident. It was, as Sergeant Mitchell suspected, part of a larger operation that we're only beginning to understand." Detective Chief Inspector Chen leaned forward, her dark eyes intense with concentration. "We've been tracking unusual activity around several high-profile locations in London for the past 6 weeks. Small things that individually seemed insignificant, but, when viewed together, they form a disturbing pattern." She began laying photographs across the table. Street vendors appearing near Downing Street, who disappeared after 1 day. Utility workers doing repairs near Westminster that we can't verify with the companies they claim to represent. Tourists taking an unusual number of photographs of security installations around royal residences. Thomas studied the images, his trained eye picking up details that others might miss. "Reconnaissance," he said quietly. "Someone's been mapping our security procedures, our response times, our personnel assignments." "Exactly," Davidson confirmed. "And now we know why. The man who attacked you, whose name we've finally determined is Marcus Webb, has connections that go far deeper than we initially realized." Davidson pulled out another photograph, this one showing a man in his 50s with graying hair and cold blue eyes. "This is Colonel Viktor Petrov, formerly of Russian military intelligence, currently believed to be operating as a freelance coordinator for various international criminal organizations. We have reason to believe he's been hired to orchestrate a series of attacks designed to test and ultimately compromise British security operations." Inspector Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're talking about an organized effort to attack the royal family?" "We're talking about something potentially much worse," Davidson replied grimly. "Intelligence suggests that Petrov has been contracted by a group with significant financial resources and political motivations. Their goal isn't necessarily to harm members of the royal family directly, though that remains a possibility. Their primary objective appears to be to demonstrate that British security is vulnerable, that our most protected institutions can be penetrated, and our most elite personnel can be compromised." The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest. He had dedicated his life to protecting others, had taken an oath to serve and defend, and Now someone was treating that commitment as nothing more than a challenge to be overcome. "What's our next move?" Thomas asked, despite the fact that he was officially on medical leave and shouldn't have been involved in the operational planning at all. Detective Chief Inspector Chen looked at him with a mixture of respect and concern. "Sergeant Mitchell, you should be recovering, not sitting in strategy meetings. You've done more than enough." "With respect, ma'am," Thomas replied firmly. "Someone tried to kill me 3 days ago as part of a plan to attack everything I've sworn to protect. I'm not going home to watch television while you figure out how to stop them." Davidson studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Actually, Sergeant Mitchell's involvement might be exactly what we need. Petrov is a professional who studies his opposition carefully. He knows that his operative failed to kill Thomas, which means he knows that Thomas is skilled, dedicated, and now personally motivated. Petrov will be planning for Thomas's continued involvement." "You want to use me as bait," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question." "We want to use you as an advantage," Davidson corrected. "Petrov expects us to pull you from active duty, to treat the knife attack as a warning and respond defensively. Instead, we're going to put you back in position and let him know that his intimidation tactics have failed. Meanwhile, we'll be watching everything and everyone around you, waiting for his people to make their next move." Inspector Williams looked skeptical. "That's putting Sergeant Mitchell at considerable personal risk. And if something happens to him, we lose one of our most experienced Royal Guards." "If something happens to me," Thomas interjected, "you'll learn something about how these people operate, and that information might save lives later. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "I'm looking forward to the opportunity to return the favor." Over the next 2 hours, they developed a comprehensive plan. Thomas would return to duty the following week, taking his normal position during a scheduled royal engagement at the Natural History Museum. The event would appear to proceed normally, but would actually be surrounded by layers of covert security personnel, surveillance equipment, and emergency response teams. Detective Chief Inspector Chun had assembled detailed profiles of known associates of both Marcus Webb and Colonel Petrov. The photographs showed a diverse group of individuals from various countries and backgrounds, but all with military or criminal experience that made them dangerous. "The concerning thing," Chun explained, "is that several of these individuals have entered the United Kingdom legally over the past 2 months, using genuine passports and legitimate cover stories. They're not operating as a traditional terrorist cell that we can track through illegal activities. They're functioning like a legitimate business operation, which makes them much harder to detect and stop." Davidson added more files to the growing collection of documents on the table. "We've identified at least 3 safe houses being used by Petrov's organization, but we can't move against them yet without potentially alerting other cells that we haven't found. Our best chance is to let them proceed with their next operation while we're prepared for it." Thomas spent the afternoon studying surveillance footage from the knife attack, analyzing his own performance, and looking for details he might have missed in the heat of the moment. What he saw both impressed and concerned him. Marcus Webb had been clearly trained in close-quarters combat and crowd manipulation. The way he moved through the people, the accuracy of his knife throw, even his choice of position in the courtyard, everything showed professional planning and execution. He wasn't trying to escape, Thomas realized, calling Davidson and Chen over to look at the footage with him. "Watch his positioning after he throws the knife. He could have run in 3 different directions that would have given him better chances to get away. But he chose the route that would lead directly into the crowd of school children." Chen studied the screen carefully. "You're right. He was trying to create maximum chaos and confusion, even at the cost of his own freedom. That suggests his mission was more about gathering intelligence on our response procedures than about actually killing you. Which means," Davidson concluded, "that the real attack is still coming. And now they know exactly how we respond to a knife-wielding attacker in a crowd situation." That evening, Thomas returned to his small apartment in South London, his mind churning with everything he had learned. The building was a converted Victorian house that had been divided into flats, and Thomas lived on the 2nd floor in a modest 1-bedroom unit that reflected his practical, no-nonsense approach to life. As he prepared a simple dinner, Thomas found himself thinking about his mother. Sarah Mitchell still lived in Manchester, still worried about her son despite his assurances that his job was safe and routine. She had called him every day since news of the attack had reached the press, and Thomas had done his best to downplay the seriousness of the incident. The truth was that Thomas had been changed by the attack in ways that went beyond the physical wound. For 6 years, he had performed his duties with confidence and professionalism, but also with the assumption that the threats he might face would be relatively straightforward. Overly enthusiastic fans, confused tourists, maybe the occasional protester who needed to be peacefully removed. The idea that he was now facing trained professionals with military-grade equipment and sophisticated operational planning was both terrifying and strangely exciting. Thomas had joined the Royal Guard partly because he wanted to serve something larger than himself, but also because he craved the kind of challenge that would test his skills and dedication to their limits. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Inspector Williams's number. "Mitchell," Thomas answered. "Sergeant, we've had a development. Marcus Webb is dead." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "How?" "He was found in his cell this morning, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. But the medical examiner has found traces of a synthetic compound in his bloodstream that can cause cardiac arrest when administered in the right dosage." The implications were clear and chilling. Someone killed him to keep him quiet. That's our working theory. Which means that Petrov knows we've been questioning Webb, and he's willing to eliminate his own people to protect the larger operation. It also means that whatever they're planning is important enough to justify losing assets. Thomas set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. "Sir, if they're willing to kill their own people, what do you think they'll do to us?" "I don't know, Sergeant. But we're going to find out. The museum event is still scheduled for tomorrow. Are you ready?" Thomas looked at his bandaged arm, thought about Marcus Webb dying alone in a cell, and considered the possibility that he might be walking into a situation that was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "Yes, sir," he said firmly. "I'm ready." But as he hung up the phone, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew about his job, his enemies, and his own capabilities was about to be tested in ways that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The next morning would bring answers to some of those questions, but it would also raise new and more disturbing possibilities about just how far Petrov and his organization were willing to go to achieve their goals. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red tunic for the third time. 28 years old with steel-gray eyes and a jaw that could cut glass, Thomas had spent the last 6 years of his life protecting the British royal family. His background was far from typical for a royal guard. Born in the rough neighborhoods of Manchester, he had clawed his way out of poverty through sheer determination and an unwavering sense of duty. Thomas remembered the day he first put on the iconic red uniform. His mother, Sarah, had tears streaming down her weathered face as she watched her son transform from a street-smart kid who had grown up dodging trouble into one of the most elite protectors in the world. The bearskin hat felt impossibly heavy that first day, but now it sat on his head like a natural extension of his body. The morning briefing had been routine. Inspector Williams, a 40-something career officer with graying temples, had gone through the usual security protocols. The Queen was scheduled for a public appearance at 2 p.m., greeting a delegation of visiting dignitaries from several Commonwealth nations. The weather was perfect, clear skies, mild temperature, and just enough breeze to keep the summer heat at bay. "Mitchell, you'll take position at the east entrance," Inspector Williams had said, pointing to a spot on the detailed floor plan spread across the briefing room table. "Standard protocol applies. Eyes sharp, posture perfect, and remember, you're not just protecting royalty, you're representing the crown itself." Thomas nodded, the same way he had nodded hundreds of times before. But something felt different about today. Call it intuition, call it experience, or call it the sixth sense that comes from years of watching crowds. Thomas had learned to trust his gut feelings. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. As he took his position, Thomas began his mental checklist. Exit routes mapped, backup positions identified, communication device tested, and functioning. His eyes swept the gathering crowd with methodical precision. Tourists with cameras, local residents hoping for a glimpse of royalty, children clutching small Union Jack flags their parents had bought from street vendors. Then he saw him. The man stood near the back of the crowd, partially hidden behind a group of excited schoolchildren on a field trip. Average height, maybe 5'9", with dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper cut in months. He wore a black hoodie despite the warm weather, and his hands were buried deep in the front pocket. But it was his eyes that caught Thomas's attention. While everyone else in the crowd was looking toward the palace entrance with anticipation and excitement, this man's gaze was fixed directly on Thomas. Most people, when they notice a royal guard looking at them, either smile, wave, or quickly look away out of respect or nervousness. This man did none of those things. He held Thomas's gaze with an intensity that was both challenging and unsettling. There was something calculating in those dark eyes, something that made Thomas's trained instincts scream warnings. Thomas activated his communication device with a subtle touch to his collar. "Control, this is Position East. I have a potential person of interest in the crowd. Male, approximately 25 to 30 years old, black hoodie, positioned behind the school group near the fountain." The response crackled through his nearly invisible earpiece. "Copy that, Position East. Description logged. Continue observation and report any suspicious behavior." The man seemed to sense that he was being watched by more than just Thomas now. A slow smile spread across his face, but it wasn't the friendly smile of someone enjoying a royal event. It was something darker, more menacing. The man's right hand shifted inside his hoodie pocket, and Thomas caught a glimpse of something metallic. Years of training kicked into high gear. Thomas's posture remained perfectly still, his face showing no emotion, but every muscle in his body was now coiled and ready for action. He had been in situations like this before, though thankfully they were rare. Most threats to the royal family came in the form of overly enthusiastic fans who got too close or protesters who needed to be peacefully removed. Actual physical threats were uncommon, but when they happened, the response had to be swift and decisive. The man began moving through the crowd, using the excitement and movement of the gathering people as cover. He was skilled at it, Thomas had to admit. Someone without security training might have lost sight of him completely. But Thomas had spent years learning to track movement through crowds, to spot the one person moving with purpose while everyone else moved with casual interest. "Control, target is mobile, moving northwest through the crowd toward the main viewing area. Recommend elevated alert status." "Copy that. Additional units being positioned. Do not engage unless immediate threat is confirmed." Thomas understood the protocol. Royal events were delicate situations where maintaining the appearance of safety and normalcy was almost as important as actually ensuring safety. Tackling someone in the crowd based on suspicious behavior alone could cause panic and potentially harm innocent bystanders. But Thomas also understood that sometimes split-second decisions had to be made without the luxury of complete information. The crowd was getting larger as the scheduled appearance time approached. Thomas estimated nearly 300 people were now gathered in the courtyard and surrounding areas. Family groups, tourists, local residents, media personnel with their cameras, and recording equipment. The atmosphere was festive, filled with the kind of excitement that comes with the possibility of seeing royalty up close. The man in the black hoodie had positioned himself about 30 feet from Thomas's post, close enough that any sudden movement could be reached in seconds, but far enough away to blend into the crowd. He was no longer looking directly at Thomas, which was somehow more unsettling than when he had been. Now he appeared to be watching the palace entrance like everyone else. But Thomas could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were set, the manner in which his weight was distributed on the balls of his feet. Thomas had seen that stance before, during his military training and in various security situations. It was the posture of someone preparing to move quickly and decisively. It was the stance of someone about to act. The palace doors opened, and a cheer went up from the crowd. Several minor officials emerged first, followed by security personnel in plain clothes who positioned themselves at strategic points around the area. The crowd pressed forward slightly, everyone trying to get a better view, cameras rising like a small forest of electronic devices. Then she appeared. Queen Elizabeth, resplendent in a powder blue coat and matching hat, stepped into the sunshine with the gracious smile that had charmed the world for decades. The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch, with people calling out greetings and children waving their flags enthusiastically. It was a scene that had played out thousands of times before, a perfect example of the pomp and ceremony that made the British monarchy such a powerful symbol around the world. But Thomas's attention was split between his duty to protect the Queen and his growing concern about the man in the black hoodie. As the Queen began her slow progress through the designated greeting area, shaking hands and exchanging brief pleasantries with selected members of the crowd, Thomas saw the man's hand move again inside his pocket. This time, there was no mistaking the shape of what he was concealing. Thomas had handled enough knives during his military service to recognize the outline of a blade, even when partially hidden. His heart rate increased, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. This was what all the training was for, what all those hours of practice and preparation were designed to handle. Control. I have confirmed visual on a concealed weapon. Target has a knife. Requesting permission to engage. The response was immediate. Permission granted. Take him down, but be mindful of civilian safety. Thomas began moving before the transmission was complete. 6 years of wearing the heavy ceremonial uniform had taught him how to move quickly while maintaining balance and control. He pushed through the crowd with practiced efficiency, his size and official presence causing people to step aside automatically. The man in the hoodie saw him coming. Their eyes met across the sea of people, and the man's expression changed from calculated menace to something approaching panic. He had clearly expected to blend into the crowd until the last possible moment. But Thomas's approach had disrupted whatever plan he had been forming. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but Thomas would remember it in slow-motion detail for the rest of his life. The man pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing an 8-inch hunting knife with a wicked curved blade. Screams began erupting from the crowd as people noticed the weapon. The man drew his arm back, and, for a terrifying moment, Thomas thought he was going to charge toward the Queen. Instead, the man pivoted and hurled the knife directly at Thomas with surprising accuracy and force. The blade spun end over end through the air, glinting in the afternoon sunlight as it traced a deadly arc through space. Thomas had perhaps 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to process the threat, calculate the trajectory, and respond appropriately. 2 seconds that would determine whether he lived or died, and whether his failure to stop this attack might put others at risk. Training took over completely. Thomas's left arm came up in a defensive motion while his right hand reached for his emergency response equipment. But the knife was coming too fast, thrown with too much skill, and forced to be completely avoided. The blade struck Thomas in the upper left arm, just below his shoulder. The razor-sharp edge sliced through the thick ceremonial fabric of his uniform and bit deep into muscle. Pain exploded through his body, but adrenaline and training kept him moving forward. The crowd erupted in chaos. People were screaming, running in all directions, parents grabbing their children and looking for exits. The carefully orchestrated royal event dissolved into pandemonium in the space of seconds. But Thomas never took his eyes off the attacker. Even with a knife wound in his arm, even with blood beginning to soak through his uniform, he continued his pursuit. The man had used his only weapon, and now Thomas had the advantage. The attacker tried to run, pushing violently through the panicked crowd. He knocked over an elderly woman, sent a small child sprawling, and caused a domino effect of people falling and struggling to get away from the danger. But Thomas was faster, stronger, and motivated by both professional duty and personal rage. He tackled the man from behind, driving him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of both of them. Thomas's injured arm screamed in protest, but he managed to get his good arm around the attacker's throat in a control hold that would prevent any further violence. "You're under arrest," Thomas growled through gritted teeth, his face pressed close to the man's ear. "And if you even think about moving, I'll make sure you regret it for whatever's left of your miserable life." Additional security personnel reached them within seconds, followed quickly by armed police officers who had been stationed nearby. The attacker was pulled to his feet, his hands secured behind his back with professional restraint techniques, while Thomas was immediately surrounded by medical personnel who began assessing his wound. The queen, Thomas noticed with relief, had been quickly escorted back into the palace by her personal protection detail. The crowd was being dispersed in an orderly fashion by uniformed officers, and the area was being secured for investigation. But as Thomas sat on the edge of an ambulance stretcher while a paramedic cleaned and bandaged his knife wound, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. The man's eyes had held something more than simple malice or mental instability. There had been purpose there, calculation, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, there had been confidence. Confidence that suggested this attack hadn't been the desperate act of a lone individual, but part of something larger and more dangerous. Inspector Williams appeared at Thomas's side, his face grim with concern and anger. "How bad is it, Sergeant?" "I'll live," Thomas replied, wincing as the paramedic applied antiseptic to the wound. "But this wasn't random, sir. That man knew exactly what he was doing. The way he moved, the way he threw that knife, the way he positioned himself in the crowd, this was planned." "We're thinking the same thing," Williams said. "The preliminary questioning isn't going well. He's not talking, not even giving us his name. And there's something else." Williams paused, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The knife. It's not some random weapon picked up from a kitchen drawer. It's military grade, special forces issue. The kind of thing that's not easy to come by unless you know exactly where to look." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his injury. Military-grade weapons suggested training, connections, and resources that went far beyond what a simple criminal or mentally disturbed individual would have access to. "Sir, I think we need to consider the possibility that this was either a test run or a distraction," Thomas said quietly. "Someone wanted to see how we'd respond, how quickly we could react, what our procedures were. And they were willing to sacrifice one operative to get that information." Williams's expression darkened. "That's exactly what we're afraid of, Sergeant. And if you're right, then this is just the beginning."